We're sitting here in front of a blow-up, a gigantic blow-up of one of your drawings, which is actually a drawing here for the museum. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the role of drawing and maybe about this drawing here specifically.
I don't know. It's overwhelming to see it that big. When I start a work, the first thing we do is make little block models of the site, of the volumes, the area, the program, and think about the relationship to the site. Once I understand that, it's a scale understanding of the terrain and everything, then I start sketching. And the sketches use that knowledge. Those sketches, the very first ones, when I look back, are uncanny in relation to the final building.
It's all down.
And I don't understand it. It's hard to understand how I got that close.
And do you remember when the inspiration for the building happened? I mean, you studied the site, it was an informed situation, and then all of a sudden...
Well, this one was pretty clear that it was a jardin d'acclimatation, it was a park. The building had to be ephemeral. From day one, you know, we realized that it couldn't be just a solid thing, that it needed to have a relation with nature and the trees, with the garden. And in my early discussions with Bernard Arnault, we talked about that issue. And we realized that if you made it in glass, you could make it higher. So from the beginning, I was playing with glass sails, and I didn't know how I was going to build them, but from the beginning, we knew we were going to have a solid piece inside, which we later called the icebergs, and the exterior, which they now call verrières. But they're glass sails, actually. Take the simplest thing of a painter, white canvas, a brush, and a palette of colors, and you look at this white canvas, and now you got to make a mark. I kept looking for the analogy in architecture, because architecture you can hide behind so many things. You can complain, well, the client wanted this, or the building department wouldn't let me do this, or the budget wouldn't let me do this, or the materials and I couldn't do it. You have an excuse mantra that's 2 miles long if you want to use it for why the building looks like that. I don't want to hide. I just want to get out there. I don't want to hide. I don't want to have any reasons. I got to keep the rain out maybe, but very simple reasons. So it's not cluttered. And Philip Johnson gave a lecture in which he talked about one-room buildings being the greatest buildings of time. And click, it said, that's it. One-room building. There's nothing. You got to just make the one room. And so I started thinking of architecture as that. I was just doing houses, so I took each room and made it a one-room building, and then put them together, and it all clicked for me that this was the way to find this moment of truth in architecture. When I have students, I have them write their signature, and then they compare signatures, and they always look different. My signature is different than yours. And I said, that's the basic you. It's not self-conscious, not contrived. You just wrote your name the way you always write it. You've got to find yourself in your work that way. And when you find it, the good news is you're the only expert. And so it doesn't matter what somebody else says. I love that. The amount of time for designing a building is usually pretty set, and the amount of time for building a building is usually pretty set. And if you don't establish these disciplines, you could go on forever. But For me, talented people use constraints to an advantage. I think of it as like surfing. You know, you're going to get on the board, you're going to get the wave, but how you manage it is that 15% of pure ingenuity and whatever it is that we bring to the table as architects. I also, you know, I sail, so this building is about sailboats. Sailing for me is the only thing that I do that I can forget everything. I just totally relax. And the reason is that you have to be constantly aware of each part of the boat, where it's going, what you're doing, what the sails are. It's peaceful and it's violent at the same time. I love it when it's violent. It's so ancient. There's nothing new, and then it's all new. It's a world in a microcosm that relates a person to nature very directly. I mean, very directly.
But it's beautiful to hear you talk about sailing in front of this maquette of the building. It's incredible.
Yeah, well, I think Disney Hall also, the front is these panels which, you know, when you're sailing with the wind behind, you put the sails out wide. It's called wing on wing. And so I told Esa-Pekka Salonen that this front was wing on wing, and he wrote a piece called Wing on Wing for the building. Imagine here a carousel designed by Jeff Koons or Murakami. This is going to feel like a part of the park, part of the Bar de Bologna, and it's open. It's breathing. It's got places outside, inside. It's an invitation. People can walk around on this white building. So they go from a gallery outside, undercover, to a garden, to a gallery. I hope the power of it will be for the younger generations to engage in it like I did at 8 years old. This is the entrance. This is the level of the Jardin d'Acclimatation, the park with the children. Imagine here a carousel designed by Jeff Koons or Murakami. Inside is this white building, which are the galleries, are in here with skylights. And people can walk around on this white building. So they go from a gallery outside, undercover, to a garden, to a gallery. So in this space, in this volume, which is huge, can be a work of art. Now the work of art in there will be seen as kind of a shadow from here, but in there you'll see it perfectly. And the same, so you could have one here, you could have one here. On this little perch you could do it. You know, so there's enough to show that the building also is receptive to those kind of things. And I wanted to see the building and create a platform and where you can hang an artwork here in this space. Could be big, could be big. So as you come to the building, it's like a theater. This is the proscenium. Yeah. So that's a lecture hall, and those seats can go down, and that can be a continuous gallery, the full length. Here, you can see it here. So that can disappear, and underneath this floor, there's a gallery, the full length of the building. This is going to feel like a part of the park, part of the Bar de Bologna, and it's open, it's breathing, it's got places outside, inside. It's an invitation. I hope the power of it will be for the younger generations to engage in it like I did at 8 years old. The building's very strong, and I know a lot of artists that will take me on and not worry about it. I do, you know. I mean, Anish Kapoor he'll have no trouble finding his voice in this. So in this space, in this volume, which is huge, can be a work of art. Now the work of art in there will be seen as kind of a shadow from here, but in there you'll see it perfectly. And the same, so you could have one here, you could have one here. On this little perch you could do it. You know, so there's enough to show that the building also is receptive to those kind of things. You can hang an artwork here in this space. Could be big, could be big, could be a big work. The building's very strong, and I know a lot of artists that will take me on and not worry about it. I do, you know. I mean, Anish Kapoor he'll have no trouble finding his voice in this. Here we have an opportunity to bring art out to the outside of the building, and it can be very strong, so that the building itself on the exterior will be an invitation to children. For example, if you put a Murakami between the glass, and then there's a Murakami inside, and there's a merry-go-round outside done by artists, the ensemble makes it children-centric. No other museum I know built now has done that. And I think the reason to do it here is because it's in the Jardin d'Acclimatation, because it's in the Bois de Boulogne, and because Bernard Arnault is a person whose mindset is to be open and show his work in the public.
So it's the opposite of a museum which is kind of closed onto itself.
Yes,
somehow?
I think it's making this accessible first and foremost to children in the park, in the Jardin d'Acclimatation. I get very romantic about it. I think of Proust. I think of how it would have been if this building were there when Proust was alive. I think of that. I mean, for me, Proust is always here. Tough, beautiful, accessible, no frills. So I think it could be an unusual museum. I grew up as a modernist, you know, it was anti-Beaux-Arts when at my school, the late 40s and 50s. And then 60, I came to France for 1 year. And when I came here, I saw the light. I realized that my teachers had made trivial the cathedrals and the great works. Decoration was, you know, like Adolphe Loos, it was a sin. The first epiphany was to walk into Notre Dame. I couldn't believe it, you know, and then going to see Chartres. And I drove around the countryside, and I went to see all the chateaux, Chambord, Chenonceau, Auxerre, Azay-le-Rideau, Chinon, you know, everything. When I saw Autun, I had an epiphany, because the sculptor, Giselle Bertus, did those figures, and they're not decorative. They're very tough, and they were part of the architecture. And I was always, from the beginning, always looking for those connections, and so I really got French history, architectural history. I think even today in Paris with the museum we're working on now, I'm very interested in bringing art to the outside of the building and part of it.
We spoke about your beginnings with art and artists. We haven't spoken much about your dialogues and collaborations, if it's with Oldenburg or Sarah, up to your friendship with Sophie Calle. I was just curious to hear a little bit more about your infinite conversations with artists.
From the very first buildings I did in LA, the architects at the time were very judgmental. If you look back, I don't think I was doing anything that crazy, but in their minds I was doing things that they couldn't feel good about. And the artists used to come around and look at the buildings, so I became friends with the artists, and I found it freer, more interesting, that they were exploring things that I thought architects should explore: form, perceptual ideas with Irwin and Terrell back then, and Doug Wheeler, and surface with the candy apple surfaces of the motorcycle guys. It seemed very direct and more relevant to making of things. And
so
it was
the principle of free association somehow. Or?
Yeah, but it was free association, but it was also the talent to, and the will to learn a technique. Like, you know, Sarah went to the shipyard, saw the way the ships were being built, got entranced with it. It became kind of a power thing for him, which, if you know his personality, it fits perfectly. And he would then be able to move tons of steel and make powerful, gutsy statements that fit his personality, and he found a way to do it. Rouchet explored the printed word, but he explored the ordinary. I was always fascinated with Rouchet because he didn't think much of architecture. But the guy that spun my wheels and turned me around was Rauschenberg. My first encounters with his work turned the light bulbs, that you could use ordinary stuff and make beauty. And I think some of my early works were about that, were inspired by that, because you couldn't get good workmanship. So I used plywood and stuff, very matter of fact, and it was accessible, and you could make beautiful spaces with it.
So Rauschenberg was a kind of an epiphany.
Yeah, and I used to spend a lot of time with him till 4 in the morning talking about things. And, you know, if you look back at the combines, you see that that was probably one of the most important statements in the 20th century. As powerful as Warhol for me, and as powerful as anybody else.
I was wondering, what's the role of chance?
It's a big role, because you're responding in real time to what you see. So my favorite John Cage expression is, not knowing cheers the knowing. He used to say that. I think most of the great things that happen in the world happen by chance. They're based on intense study, intense explorations, sometimes conscious. Some of my colleagues fix the design and they stay there, and then if you try to change it, they get nervous and are very rigid, and I've never been like that. The basic idea was set right from the very beginning. And we went through, we always do on every project, maybe 30 models of refinement. And our client, Mr. Arnault, participated in all of those iterations. And I think it took a while to get to a resolution of the direction. And we were trying things that were unusual for this kind of building.
And it really is very much a process. As you told me just a few hours ago, the maquette changed again significantly.
I just had a feeling that we should pare it back a little bit. It was a little bit full. The changes that we made here today, or this last week, are within the confines of the technical schedule. We simplified a few things, and it was easy to do.
Does the process ever stop?
If Bernard Arnault comes in and says, well, it doesn't feel right, something here, then I would be willing to reopen the case and study it quickly and come up with a solution. I love that. I'm not threatened by that. Some people get nervous when I do that, but that's how I work best with people.